And away we go. We're moving. They were the machines that made Britain great. Fast, revolutionary, and sometimes downright dangerous. These are the stories of our engineering masterpieces that shook the world and drive the way we live today.
This is a decade of great leaps in technology, an era of new wonders. The evolution of engines, electricity and communications changed people's lives and produced landmark historic triumphs.
But overshadowing it all was tragedy. Back in the 1910s, the combination of new machines and human incompetence all too often led to disaster.
The Titanic, the largest ship the world had ever seen, sunk. Efficient new weapons, 16 million dead. But at the start of the First World War, there was still hope.
Don't worry, they said. It will all be over by Christmas.
In the 1910s, people worked up to 80 hours a week, so time off was precious. But thanks to the rapid evolution of the petrol engine, there was now a new way to enjoy it.
This is a 1914 Leyland torpedo char-a-bang. The word char-a-bang comes from the French char-à-banc, which means carriage with wooden benches. Fabulous.
Based on earlier horse-drawn vehicles, this machine was the forerunner of the coach, the booze cruise, even low-cost airliners.
What makes this vehicle so great is its size. In the days of the horse, a large carriage could maybe carry 12 people. This carried 32.
All thanks to huge increases in the power of petrol engines.
Powering this machine, we have a magnificent 4-cylinder, 36 horsepower Leyland S4 petrol engine. And it's the 36 horsepower motor that makes this vehicle possible. You can't tether 36 horses to the front of a coach, and if you could, you'd have a spot of bother controlling them.
For the first time, a coach could compete with the trains and carry groups of people to places the railways didn't reach. And it carried them in style.
When we hear the word Leyland, we tend to think of the troubled car maker of the 1970s and 80s. But look at this. By royal appointment. In the 1910s, Leyland was the Rolls-Royce of commercial vehicles.
This machine has been beautifully restored. With its hand-painted coachwork and plush leather seats, this majestic vehicle offered people a taste of luxury and excitement they had never experienced before. The char-a-bang kicked off motorized tourism, and they must have been popular. In all the photographs, the vehicles are crammed with people. You could hire them by the day, and companies used them to give their workers a grand day out.
Early in the morning at the village hall or the company works, the excited holidaymakers would get on board. And away we go. For many workers, this would have been their first experience of a holiday. These were cheery outings to local attractions, a picnic in the country, a town fair, or a trip to the seaside.
By all accounts, the passengers could get pretty rowdy. Some char-a-bangs were like travelling pubs with their own barrels of beer at the back.
Cheers.
People sang, played musical instruments, and were even known to fall off drunk. The char-a-bang often left a trail of chaos in its wake. So with a large vehicle to control and a bunch of noisy, high-spirited holidaygoers in the back, it made for a tricky drive. Just like a coach driver nowadays, eh?
To the uninitiated, driving one of these machines presents a few challenges.
Not least, trying to apply the brakes.
You have this lever here, which acts only on the back wheels. But instead of pulling it the conventional way, it's slightly unconventional. You've got to push it away from you. In severe cases, you would use the foot brake, which acts on the gearbox. If you're on a very steep hill with a very heavy load, you've got a water tank over there where you can drip water onto that brake of the gearbox to keep it cool.
Once at their destination, the tourists would indulge in the pleasures of the time, swimming in the daring new bathing dresses, having their photos snapped, watching vaudeville shows, and of course, plenty more drinking. Fortunately, when the time came to go home, the driver had a not too subtle way to get the passengers out of the pub.
The old bulb horn wasn't any good, far too quiet, so some charabancs were fitted with what's known as an exhaust whistle. If I pull this ring here, it opens a valve on the cylinder head and the rising piston pushes the gases out. If I increase revs, the piston's moving faster, we get more frequency.
Hold on a sec! Hold on a sec! Wait! Wait!
A great British machine that brought joy to a generation. The 1910s was a decade of new wonders. Electric light advertising appeared for the first time in London. Music halls gave way to cinema, creating the world's first international star, Charlie Chaplin. It was an age of heroes. Daring young men took to the skies in fragile machines held together by canvas and wire. Ernest Shackleton explored Antarctica. Captain Scott made it to the South Pole. And back home, thanks to new technology, thousands of ordinary people were embracing the spirit of adventure. Is it a car? Is it a bike? This is in fact a cycle car.
This has to be one of the smallest cars I've ever driven. In fact, it's barely a car because it only has 3 wheels.
It may be small, but this ingenious British vehicle changed motoring forever. Before the cycle car, the few cars on the roads were mainly large limousines, built for the wealthy and driven by their chauffeurs.
In the early 1900s, or so the story goes, the finance people at Daimler estimated that the worldwide demand for cars would never reach more than 1 million, ever. The limiting factor, they declared, was that you would never be able to recruit 1 million chauffeurs.
The arrival of cycle cars blew those calculations away. They were cheaper, more popular, and arguably more revolutionary even than Henry Ford's mass-produced Model T.
Dozens of small manufacturers began to attach motorcycle engines to home-built frames. One of them was based here, in Malvern.
Today, we think of Morgans as elegant, expensive, and traditional. But in the early days, under the leadership of Harry Morgan, they were radical innovators. Morgan didn't see why ordinary folk should be limited to where the charabancs and trains could take them. So he set out to design and build a car for the people, to go wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. At his factory in Malvern, he and his team came up with their 3-wheeled revolution. And in 1911, he launched the aptly named Runabout. Costing just £90, equivalent to the price of today's cheapest cars, it sold like hotcakes.
If you drove one of these, you probably couldn't afford a chauffeur. You probably didn't want one. Instead, you did something radical, something fun. You drove yourself.
So what were the secrets to this cycle car's success?
Let's take a closer look at this fantastic runabout. High-tech bonnets, you'll notice. Let's hope it doesn't fail me or I'm in trouble. Right, independent front suspension, petrol tank up here, 964cc V-twin air-cooled side valve Jap engine. No leaky radiator to worry about here. Now this unit powered the vehicle via the prop shaft and a 2-speed chain transmission. Nice and simple, which of course keeps maintenance costs down. But best of all, you got a proper steering wheel and room for a passenger, just. And all this for less than 90 quid.
Morgan knew that being cheap to buy wasn't enough. It needed to be cheap to run as well. In those days, you would fill your car up from one of the new 2-gallon petrol cans, bought at your local chemist or bicycle shop.
So how far can this little delight go on a tank full? Let's find out.
Chris Booth, the owner, is coming along to make sure I don't wreck what is now an extremely valuable original.
Ah, yes. Despite its small engine, and because it's so light, this really is a very nifty vehicle. It can cruise comfortably at 30 to 35 miles an hour. Might not sound much, but back in those days, it was enough to scare the natives.
In 1913, the official speed limit was an eye-watering 20 miles an hour.
With its 3-gallon tank, driven sensibly, you could get about 150 miles between stops, which is just as well, because in the 1910s, there were no petrol stations.
The cycle car craze swept the country. By 1914, it was reckoned that for every big, luxurious, chauffeur-driven car on the road, there were 100 smaller cars like the runabout. People raced them in speed trials, hill climbs, and long-distance reliability tests. There was even an international Grand Prix won by a Morgan three-wheeler. Britain's roads filled up with little runabouts, and for the first time in history, powerful machines moved out of the hands of experts and into the hands of the masses.
Transforming Britain into a nation of motorists. And so was born the traffic jam.
In the early 1910s, the peace and prosperity of the British people was under threat. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was building up his army, and the shadow of war loomed over the country. Britain began pouring money into manufacturing arms. To make them, she needed steel. And to help produce it efficiently, the country built one of its greatest and most iconic machines. With dozens of moving parts, it certainly looks like a machine, but in fact, it's a moving bridge. All 2,600 tons of it.
The Middlesbrough Transporter Bridge spans the River Tees, and it's not just your normal bridge. It's far more radical than that. It's a cross between a bridge and a ferry, and it's the longest operating transporter bridge in the world.
In the 19th century, Middlesbrough had grown from a small hamlet to one of the largest manufacturers of iron and steel in the world. The problem was that the city was separated from most of the ironworks by the River Tees. They depended on a ferry to get the workers to work on time.
But in bad weather, the ferry was often late or didn't run at all.
Losing serious amounts of productivity, the factory owners demanded a bridge. But to build a conventional bridge tall enough for the sailing ships that had to pass underneath would have been prohibitively expensive.
A Hartlepool engineer by the name of Charles Smith came up with a solution. He called it a ferry bridge.
Smith's quirky idea was to carry people and vehicles on a gondola slung below a tall steel bridge at ground level. In 1910, construction began. This extraordinary feat of engineering was completed in less than 2 years. And in October 1811, it was unveiled to the world with great ceremony. Almost 100 years later, this amazing machine is still working exactly as it did on the day they turned the power on.
I'm 165 feet above the river, and below me, attached to 60 wheels, runs the upper carriage.
Attached to this are 30 steel cables which carry the gondola below. They are cleverly cross-wired to stop the 65-ton gondola blowing around in the wind as it makes the crossing in just 90 seconds.
It's a bit like an upside-down railway, with the railway bit up here and the transport bit underneath. Back in 1911, when they'd finished building the bridge, they tested it by driving a steamroller onto the gondola. Let's see if it's still up to the job, shall we?
This 1916 Aveling & Porter steamroller weighs 14 tons, and it's not easy to drive. Tricky steering, and you don't stop it with a brake, you have to put it into reverse. If I get this wrong, the gondola's barrier isn't going to stop me in this beautiful machine crashing into the T's.
Concentrate!
I said concentrate, Barrie.
Yes, the gondola can still take it. And look at this, two masterpieces of 1910's British technology reunited. Now, to get it across the river.
The gondola is operated from a control room up on its roof. Alan Murray, the bridge master, is going to show me how to drive it.
Right, Alan, nice to meet you. The transporter bridge is powered by electricity. Now, back in 1911, electricity was a relatively new technology, but it had one big advantage. It meant the driver could control the gondola in the same way he would a tram.
So we're going to go to there to drive and there to brake. So that's our first notch. But before you do that,
Yep.
you have to stand on our dead man panel. That will give you the power.
So, foot in there.
Yes. And we need to go to that notch to make it go.
Okay, up we go.
The lever control gives me 3 speeds in both directions.
I can increase the speed.
You can indeed, by just notching up.
Like a tram, the electricity goes up through contacts to overhead wires strung across the bridge. The wires run to the engine house on the south side of the river. So I'm directly controlling 2 500-volt DC Westinghouse electric motors. Together, they produce up to 60 horsepower to precisely control the cable winch, which in turn pulls the gondola backwards and forwards across the bridge. All the motors, controls, and even the switchboard are original. In the last 98 years, they have driven the gondola nearly 1 million miles.
And when we come in to dock, you've got to watch for our state-of-the-art docking mechanism.
Right.
Come off power, and then you go in. Now, if you come into the brake now,
Okay.
and just hold it there for the first notch, because we're docking so slowly, that brake will hold it all the way in.
Okay, there we go. We've got a high-tech system of lining up the red tape on the windows with a bit of wood nailed to the bridge. There it is, yep. Right between those two. Look at that. Fabulous.
And that's it. Foot off the pedal now. There we go.
There we go. I've driven the Middlesbrough Transporter Bridge gondola.
One steamroller safely delivered, just as it was in 1911. This wonderful, quirky machine played its part in the growth of British industry, and the steelworkers never had an excuse to be late for work again.
In the 1910s, Britain was an industrial powerhouse. We exported goods to every corner of the globe. Over a third of the world's ships were British, and throughout the land, estuaries rang to the sound of shipbuilding.
But there was one ship that was to become more famous than any other. Yes, RMS Titanic. Launched in Belfast in 1911, it was the largest ship in the world. And a great British machine, until the captain, with great British incompetence, sailed it into an iceberg. Fortunately, inside Titanic, there was another great British machine.
The device which made rescue possible and saved 700 lives was the ship's radio.
As Titanic began to sink with 2,200 people on board, it sent out a distress call.
To hear what the Titanic's distress signal sounded like, Tony Constable here is going to reproduce part of it. Go ahead, Tony. Coming through loud and clear. What did you actually say there?
SOS.
Ah, help.
In the 1910s, radio was as revolutionary as the internet is today. Not all ships carried sets, but those that did mainly used British equipment like this, similar to the one on Titanic.
In these early days of radio, you sent your messages using this key here as dots and dashes of Morse code. This controlled the device at the heart of the Titanic's transmitter, the spark generator. Every time the operator tapped a key, it created a short burst for a dot and a long burst for a dash.
The spark sent a voltage pulse up to the ship's aerial, where it was transmitted as radio waves.
Generating radio waves like this was easy. The hard part was detecting them.
To pick up Titanic's distress call, radio operators on nearby ships relied on a device called a magnetic detector.
There were other radio receivers at this time, but the magnetic detector was the first one that was robust enough to work at sea. It's this device that made ship's radio possible.
It was based on a discovery made in Cambridge by the great physicist Ernest Rutherford. He discovered that a magnetically charged iron wire subjected to radio waves became demagnetized. At his Chelmsford factory in Essex, Guglielmo Marconi turned Rutherford's discovery into a working machine.
Marconi's genius was coming up with this constantly moving loop of wire that automatically remagnetizes every time it passes these magnets.
An incoming radio signal demagnetizes the wire, which is immediately remagnetized by the magnets so it can receive another signal. This constantly changing magnetism creates an electric current, which the operator's headphones then transform into sound. Simple, really? And totally reliable, as long as you kept the clockwork mechanism wound up. When Titanic sent out her distress signal just after midnight, it was picked up by another passenger steamship, RMS Carpathia. But Carpathia was 3.5 hours away, and by the time it arrived, it was too late to save most of the people on board.
The sad part of this story is that another ship, the Californian, was even closer to the Titanic.
However, the radio operator on the Californian had gone to bed for the night. And when the third officer popped into the radio room just when Titanic was sending out her SOS signal, there was silence. He didn't notice that the clockwork drive of the magnetic detector had run down, and so he never heard Titanic's distress call. If he had only wound up the clockwork mechanism, he could have saved all 2,000 people on board.
As it was, Rutherford's discovery of the magnetic detector and Marconi's use of it in the ship's wireless saved 700 lives. The dramatic rescue alerted the world to the importance of radio, and soon every ship would have one.
The Titanic tragedy shocked a nation that in the 1910s convulsed with social unrest. Workers repeatedly went on strike for decent conditions. In London's Sydney Street, a gang of anarchists fired on the Home Secretary Winston Churchill, and suffragettes fought to win women the vote. However, in 1914, the country suspended its internal struggles and united to fight the Hun. In August 1914, the First World War shattered Britain's peace and prosperity.
At first, people remained optimistic. Don't worry, they said, it will all be over by Christmas. It wasn't. By Christmas, the British Army were bogged down in the trenches.
The Allies had stopped the German advance, but thanks to the ingenuity of new weapons, they now faced a deadly stalemate.
For the infantry, there was one weapon that outperformed all others, the machine gun.
For the British, that meant the Vickers machine gun. Capable of firing 600 rounds a minute, the Vickers perfected an automatic reloading system dreamed up many years before. In the early 1880s, Hiram Maxim, an American inventor living in London, had a eureka moment. Whilst firing a rifle, he developed a sore shoulder from the recoil of the gun. He realized that with a bit of clever engineering, he could use the energy of the recoil to throw out the spent cartridge and load the next. The result was the world's first automatic machine gun, the Maxim gun. In 1896, the British company Vickers bought Maxim's company and set about improving the weapon. They reduced its weight by taking out all unnecessary parts and devised an ingenious mechanism to improve its reliability. This muzzle booster on the front increased the gun's recoil and helped it reload automatically. As the bullet passes through this hole, it's blocked for a fraction of a second. The expanding gases created by the firing of a bullet now have nowhere to go. They force this plunger back, which cocks the mechanism in readiness for the next round. Well, let's give it a try, shall we? Even firing blanks, I get a sense of the awesome power of this weapon. It can fire as many rounds in a minute as 40 men with rifles. Don't think I'd like to be on the receiving end. In just 20 seconds, I've fired 200 rounds, enough to kill 200 people. With a range of 2.5 miles, this was one of the most lethal weapons on the fields of Flanders. In fact, it was so efficient that in 1914, the Vickers machine gun and its German equivalent made it almost impossible for infantry to cross no man's land unscathed. It helped create the deadlock of trench warfare, the stalemate that lengthened the war and cost millions of lives. In 1915, Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, was looking for a mechanical way to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Churchill wanted a machine that could cross the muddy, cratered terrain of no man's land, while also being able to withstand the onslaught of machine gun fire.
We must crush the trenches in, he said. We must crush them in. That is the only way.
So he set up a committee to build what he called landships.
Attention quickly turned to a curious prototype from 10 years earlier. Back in 1904, Grantham engineer David Roberts had devised a brilliant off-road alternative to wheels for a new tractor, his chain or caterpillar tracks. This is a 1/3 scale model of his steam-powered Hornsby chain track tractor. The original weighed 40 tons, but the tracks spread the weight over a large area of ground, so it didn't get bogged down in the mud. The vehicle looked like a winner, and a version was offered to the army as an artillery tractor to pull heavy guns.
The army hardly leapt up and down with excitement at the idea. They bought a petrol version as a tryout, but one Royal Artillery officer declared, "Its noise and smell are abominable. A team of 8 horses is far superior under every condition." And they dropped the order.
But a few years later, Churchill's Landship Committee would turn Roberts' idea into a revolutionary new weapon.
The plan was to combine caterpillar tracks with the armour of armoured cars to make a machine that could withstand bullets and go over trenches.
The brains came in particular from 2 men. Walter Wilson was an engineering genius working in the British Army, while William Tritton was the general manager of Foster's, a small Lincoln engineering company.
After trying many ideas, this is the vehicle they came up with. Little Willie, the world's first tank.
It weighed 14 tons, carried a crew of 3, and had a top speed of a little over 3 miles an hour. In trials, the new Caterpillar track worked well, and Little Willie would be able to cross a muddy, bumpy stretch of no man's land without difficulty. But there was a flaw.
So here we are across no man's land, approaching enemy trench. Whoops. If a particular trench was too wide, Little Willie simply couldn't bridge the gap, and her Caterpillar tracks couldn't pull her out of the trench. It was back to the drawing board. The new tank was much bigger, long enough to cross trenches. But as soon as you see it, the thing that makes it immediately different is that the tracks were wrapped all the way around the hull. And here's the clever bit. The rhomboid shape of the tank gives this shallow angle of track at the front, so as the tank dips into the trench, this shallow angle of track pulls the tank out of the trench, like so, no problem.
And it really did work in practice. The design became the standard for the classic tanks of the First World War. Churchill had got his landship, and it evolved rapidly.
This is the famous Mark IV version. At 28 tons, it's twice the weight of Little Willie, and its 105 horsepower Daimler engine powered it along at the slightly higher speed of 4 miles an hour. It's this version, more than any other, that changed the face of modern warfare.
In 1917, British munitions factories went into overdrive to produce over 1,000 Mark IV tanks. The Mark IV tank carried an 8-man crew, squeezed in here for hours at a time. Tank historian David Fletcher is an authority on these pioneering machines.
What was it like inside this tank for the crews going into battle?
All the time you're going along in this thing, the tank is being impacted by machine gun bullets, absolutely continually spattering like heavy rain all around the sides of it.
Right.
The conditions in here are horrifying. When that engine's running, the noise is so loud you can't hear yourself think, never mind anybody else speak. It's generating heat through the exhaust on a tremendous scale, be about the same as a turkey in the oven for Christmas. And there are fumes coming off the thing, great clouds of carbon monoxide. So a lot of the people in the tank are sort of half useless.
The crew needed all their powers of concentration just to drive this machine. To turn it, you had to slow down one track more than the other, and it took 4 people to operate all the brakes and gears, a terrible waste of manpower. In battle, the hail of machine gun fire was so intense that even inside the tank, the crew were far from safe.
Well, the only thing they had by way of personal protection is this, which is a leather face mask with a chainmail bit at the bottom. But these things were issued in order to protect the eyes and face from tiny droplets of lead which would come in through the cracks in the armour, or even bits of armour flaking off the inside when there was impact on the outside. Just try it on the side, have a quick look through, and you'll see the view is better than you'd think.
Yeah, you can see more than you think you're going to see through those slits. But yeah, I suppose after a while, once you perspire, they just sort of slip down the front of the face.
Just slides down your face, and then you can't see anything.
In November 1917, the British deployed 476 Mark IV tanks at the Battle of Cambrai in France. They broke through the German lines, crossed 2 sets of trenches, and advanced 3 miles into enemy territory. It was a great breakthrough. When news reached Britain, the church bells rang in celebration. But by 1918, the Mark IV tank was last year's model.
This is the Mark V, and behind its boiler-plated exterior, it's a whole new beast. A 4-speed manual gearbox and a hand-operated brake for each track meant that this was the first tank that could be driven by one person.
Which freed up the rest of the crew to fight the enemy.
And at the heart of this machine, created by brilliant young engineer Harry Ricardo, is the first engine designed specifically for tanks, and it's a monster.
This 19-litre 6-cylinder 4-stroke powerhouse delivers 150 horsepower to the twin tracks.
But for me, the best thing about this fantastic 90-year-old engine is that it still runs. And they've allowed me to start it up. So here we go. There's the starter motor solenoid.
Gone are the sleeve valves that created all the smoke. In are overhead valves and crosshead pistons.
Sounds absolutely gorgeous, this engine.
The tank didn't win the First World War on its own, but by breaking the deadlock of trench warfare, it tipped the balance in our favour.
For the first time, we had a weapon that was technologically more advanced than anything the Germans had. It boosted British morale and struck terror into the hearts of the enemy. It was, and still is, a great British machine.
In November 1918, the end of the war brought rejoicing on the streets. During the conflict, British engineers had pushed back the frontiers of technology and created a formidable array of new weapons and vehicles. Some of the most extraordinary advances were in the development of flight. And this decade of triumph and tragedy would end with a British aircraft making an heroic voyage that would transform air travel forever. The person who would make it happen was a young pilot called John Alcock.
While flying for the British during the war, Alcock's aircraft crashed, and he found himself stuck in a prisoner of war camp. While he was there, he dreamed of achieving something extraordinary. He knew that no one had ever flown a plane across the Atlantic, and he knew that the Daily Mail were offering a £10,000 prize to the first person to do it. Alcock became determined to win that prize.
Back in Britain after the war, he approached the Vickers Aircraft Company at Brooklands. Fired by his enthusiasm, they agreed to let him pilot one of their planes.
And this is a replica of that aircraft, the Vickers Vimy. It's absolutely extraordinary that anyone would even dream of flying across the Atlantic in this. It's a giant biplane, for goodness sake. It's got an open cockpit and canvas wings.
This is the world's largest flying biplane. It has a 70-foot wingspan and stands over 15 feet high. The Vimy was developed during the war as a bomber to carry out night raids over Germany. It was made possible by massive increases in the power of petrol engines. Alcock's original was equipped with 2 Rolls-Royce Eagle 8 engines, each capable of delivering a thumping 360 horsepower. And just 16 years into the development of aircraft, a lot of thought was going into aerodynamics.
Wherever possible, the aircraft is streamlined to reduce wind resistance. And if you look at the struts and wires, they're not round, but they're shaped like aerofoils. The undercarriage doesn't retract like a modern aircraft. The best they could do with the original was to cover the wheel with canvas to cut down turbulence from the spokes.
This replica was built in the 1990s, but the maintenance costs are so high that it's heading for retirement in the Brooklands Museum. At least that's the plan.
So the first exercise, it seems, here is to actually get the aircraft out of the hangar.
Today, it's due to make its last ever flight.
There's a few experts here who are lending their wisdom to this initial task. What we really need is a giant pair of scissors to cut off those flaps there, and then it would come out easily. It's a bit of geometry and physics and coordinated team power.
Okay, yeah, please.
We are only inches to spare this side, so any uncoordinated pull could cause a problem.
This magnificent replica is historic in its own right. It has flown thousands of miles along the pioneering routes the original flew 90 years ago.
The Vimy is released from the hangar.
Oh, well, here I am at last in the Vimy cockpit. And my first impressions are that you'd have to be very friendly with the person you're sitting next to. Because if you're going to fly the Atlantic in this machine, you're going to be in close quarters for quite a long time. And inside here, the most distinctive feature is this 2/3 of a steering wheel to steer them across the Atlantic.
Everything on this aircraft is controlled by wires. The elevator flaps, which point the plane up and down. The ailerons that roll the aircraft from side to side.
Quite sort of low gearing on those, actually.
And the rudder for turning. And instead of bomb bays, the fuselage is filled with petrol tanks. It all feels very vulnerable. In 1919, Alcock and his navigator Arthur Brown needed to move fast. Several other teams were hoping to grab the transatlantic prize.
Everyone realized that the best way to get across the Atlantic was to fly with the strong prevailing winds from west to east. So first, they had to take the aircraft to pieces and ship it to Newfoundland.
By the time Alcock and Brown arrived, attempts by two other teams had ended in failure, with their aircraft ditching into the Atlantic. Their chance of success looked slim.
So here we are, all fueled up, all the preliminaries done. Nice weather to fly in. The Vimy is about to take off. Excellent, very exciting.
On Saturday, the 14th of June, 1919, Alcock pushed the throttle on the twin Rolls-Royce Eagle engines and powered the Vimy into the sky.
And so the Vimy takes to the skies. It may look fragile and archaic today, but back in 1919, this was cutting-edge technology.
Laden with 865 gallons of fuel, sandwiches and beer, the plane only just lifted off the ground. Alcock turned the Vimy and headed out over the Atlantic for Europe, 1,890 miles away. In the open cockpit, the crew were exposed to the noise of the engines and the full force of the elements. Flying as high as 12,000 feet, they had to wear electrically heated suits to keep themselves warm.
Early on, they lost radio contact. They hit fog and sleet, and for 4 hours the aircraft was covered with a sheet of ice. At one point, they flew into such a heavy cloud that Alcock completely lost his bearings.
the plane went into a spinning nosedive and only straightened up 50 feet above the sea. Brown said later, "It appeared as if we could stretch downwards and almost touch the great whitecaps that crested the surface."
It was an epic flight. On the 15th of June 1919, after 16 hours of flying, much of it through the night, Alcock and Brown crossed the coast of Ireland. They brought the plane down on what they thought was a field. It turned out to be a bog.
It wasn't the most elegant of landings, but they'd made it. To the small crowd of locals who greeted them, Alcock announced, "Yesterday I was in America." I'm the first person in Europe who can say that.
On June the 14th, 1919, man was Admiral of the Ocean Air.
5 days later, Winston Churchill presented Alcock and Brown with the £10,000 prize. They were the first people to fly non-stop across the Atlantic. The nation was ecstatic. On a triumphant tour of London, crowds mobbed the two heroes. But there was a third British hero, the Vimy, the aircraft that made it all possible.
It would be 8 years before another aircraft crossed the Atlantic, and another 20 before the first commercial flight. But the Vickers Vimy had paved the way.
The Vimy was the crowning achievement of a decade of triumph and tragedy. For the first time, large numbers of people got to handle powerful machines. The destructive power of some of them unleashed unprecedented horrors. But in the hands of the people, the latest mechanical wonders also promised a world of new opportunities. The century of the machine was underway.